Hi, my name is Chris Brennan from theastrologyschool.com, and in this video I want to answer a question that I get from time to time from new students of astrology who are curious whether they should learn natal astrology or horary astrology first, if they're largely new to the subject and they want to figure out which branch of astrology to specialize in first. So I get this question actually relatively frequently from new students of astrology, and it's a good question because it actually shows a little bit of awareness that there are different types of astrology or there are different branches of astrology, which are essentially different applications of the subject to sort of different ways of using it, more or less. So, as I covered in a past video, there's at least four major branches of Western astrology, or at least traditionally there's always been four major branches. The first is natal astrology, which is studying the birth charts of individuals. The second is mundane astrology, which is studying the application of astrology to large groups of people, such as cities and nations. The third application is electional astrology, which is picking auspicious dates to begin new ventures and undertakings in the future. And then finally, there's horary astrology, which is casting a chart for the moment of a question in order to attempt to determine the outcome to the question based just on the chart itself. So when it comes to natal astrology and horary astrology, my quick answer to that question is that I think it's a better idea to study natal astrology first, and then later go on to study horary astrology. So I don't necessarily have anything against horary astrology, and it's something that I think is actually pretty cool and that I practice myself from time to time. However, when it comes to new students who want to learn astrology from the ground up, I think you'd definitely be better served by studying natal astrology first, and that's because most of the basic techniques of Western astrology were originally developed within the context of natal astrology. And so, to me, part of the answer to this question is which one does it make more conceptual sense to learn first if you're starting to learn sort of the basics of Western astrology in general? So, what I mean by that is that most of the techniques that Western astrologers use in terms of the fourfold system of planets, signs, houses, and aspects, most of that system came together relatively quickly about 2,000 years ago in or around the 1st century BC in Egypt and especially around the city of Alexandria. So most of the techniques that were introduced at that time were introduced explicitly within the context of natal astrology, and that was the most popular form of astrology at that time. And the vast majority of the textbooks from astrologers that survive from that time period are on natal astrology, and a lot of the techniques are explicitly discussed within the context of natal astrology. The most important one for our purposes is the concept of the 12 houses, which is a major aspect or a major feature of Western astrology that makes it unique compared to other traditions from, let's say, Chinese astrology or Mesoamerican astrology or what have you. So the concept of the 12 houses is essentially introduced at this time around the 1st century BCE, and most of the meanings or the significations of the houses were originally developed within the context of natal astrology, and it's not that they only make sense in that context, because if you look at them from an archetypal standpoint, or if you look at them broadly enough, you can apply them to other areas such as electional astrology or horary or mundane or what have you. But the fact that I would argue that the fact that they were originally developed within the context of natal astrology means that it probably makes more sense to originally or first learn the concept of the houses and their meetings within that context rather than through one of the other applications that developed later, such as horary. So chronologically speaking, natal astrology is really popular in the 1st century. There's also some texts on mundane astrology, and there's also some texts on electional astrology, but there's only like a few references on horary astrology, or a few scattered references, until several centuries later. And it's really not until the medieval period, and especially the Renaissance period, that horary astrology exploded in popularity, and for some astrologers became their primary practice. So from a historical perspective then, we could say there's a good argument for learning natal astrology first, if that was the original context within which some of these techniques, like the 12 houses, developed. And I would argue that if you do that, if you study it more from a chronological standpoint, that you'll be in a better position to understand how the meanings of the houses grew and developed over the course of the next 2,000 years. And so that when you get around to finally studying it within the context of horary, you'll understand, for example, why the fifth house was associated with children, why the 11th house is associated with friends, why the fourth house is associated with parents, or the third house is associated with siblings. So a lot of those assignments were first developed because astrologers were primarily using the system to study the lives of individuals and in order to study a person's fate from the perspective of their birth chart. And then later that system was sort of adapted in order to apply it to other applications such as electional and horary. So to make a long story short, that's my quick and easy answer to this somewhat complicated question. I realize others, depending on what their specialty is or what their focus is, they may have other answers to that question, but that's how I would approach it from more of a historical perspective, by arguing that since natal astrology was developed first, and since the concept of the 12 houses was originally introduced within the context of natal astrology, that it makes more sense to study the system as a whole and to learn the system as a whole within that context at this point in time, and then later to branch out and move into other areas such as electional and horary astrology. All right, so I think that's it for this video, so thanks for watching. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments section below. Please be sure to like and subscribe and all of that good stuff that I'm supposed to say at the end of every YouTube video, and I will see you next time.